Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. Feel free to like, comment, share, and subscribe. There'll be a quote at the end. There are lots of people out there doing the differences in words, particularly in North America and the UK. Now, this is primarily on the USA, but does include Canada, which has a lot of they use the similar words, or the same words actually, to mean the same thing. Now, these are the words that I have seen and know about over quite a few decades. There's literally quite a lot, 100, maybe 200 even, that are used. Now you'll see people who are familiar because they go abroad to one country or another, and they'll give you the most commonest ones. But I'm going to tell you of all the ones that I have learned over these few decades. And they'll include some that perhaps you wondered about, but you weren't quite sure what they mean. In this version, I will score as well, which is probably the better word, in my opinion, that is, of course. So we'll see who comes out on top at the end. Okay, many of these words, as I said, used in Canada, but perhaps not all. So let's see how familiar you are, and feel free to do your own scoring system, comment as well, and see which ones you know as well. American English is more literal and perhaps more accurate, but this may not mean that the British English is less clear. It's just perhaps different. I've split these sections into 6 parts. I was going to do alphabetical, but 6 parts is much better. So let's get to it. This is part 1. Buildings, places in a building, streets, and shops on streets. You'll see as we go along. So let's go with the first one. What would you call a building where you might live in the US? Not a house, this type of place. In America, you would call it an apartment. In the UK, you would call it more commonly a flat. Now you can understand an apartment and probably an apartment separate from a house. And a flat, maybe because it's a flat single level. So they're accurate in that sort of way. But which one would you say is better? Which would score the point in this case? Apartment separate from a house, and a flat single dwelling sort of place. I think I would give this equal. They close a draw on this one for me. You can let me know if you think differently. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, what do you call a building that houses many of these either apartments or flats? In the USA, you would call it an apartment building. In the UK, you would call it a block of flats. So that makes sense. So an apartment, a building full of apartments, and a flat is a block. Let's go straight up, block of flats. Again, let's decide. One is neither better than the other. They make sense to each other. So I think again, I'll give them a draw, equal points on that one. Next, what would you call somewhere if you had a serious thing and you had to rush to the hospital? What area would you go to first? In America, you would go to the ER or emergency room. In the UK, you would go to the A&E, which stands for accident and emergency, also known as casualty. So which one will be better in this case? I would have to say they both make sense, emergency room and accident and emergency. But emergency room is simple, straight to the point, it gets there. So I'd give that a point to the USA on this one. Okay, again, sticking with the same theme, if you had to go specifically somewhere to pick up medicine, you had a prescription and you had to get that filled, where would you go to a specific shop or store? In America, you would go to the drugstore. In the UK, you would go to the chemist. Now that sounds actually makes sense from a drugstore for the drugs, but it also maybe in the UK makes you feel somewhere you get drugs, even though they are legal drugs for medication. But a chemist makes sense because back in the day, chemists used to mix up medicines which you would take, before they become standardized and had all these legal requirements. They used to put all sorts and make all sorts of things. So, drugstore or chemist, they're both accurate, but they all sort of, it depends if what you're used to. Drugstore, I would say, edges it that little bit more, because when you think about drugs, and it's not going to be illegal drugs, but I would say they're equal. I'll give them equal points on this one. Okay, so what do you call this item next? Used in the construction industry. In the US, it's called a cinder block, and you see them used a lot in YouTube when they use them for ballistics testing and so on. In the UK, we call this a breeze block. When I was looking at these words, I was thinking, a cinder block, it's not going to set it on fire. Is it to keep cinders out? To keep out heat and fire? I'd have to look into that. Or if you know exactly where the history is of, you can let me know. Because a breeze block as well, is it to keep out the wind? Because once it's in the building and you put on plaster and paint and so on, it's going to obviously keep that out. It makes sense, both of them, either to keep heat in or to keep the wind out. So which is better? I think on name, neither sound accurate apart from the word block, but they both do the same thing, so equal points again on this one. Okay, so now you've got a house, let's call it. What do you call, you open your front door, what's that level? In the USA, you would say ground floor. And more confusingly, perhaps to the US, in the UK, you would call that the first floor. Now this would be confusing because America, the first floor would be the next level up, but the next level up in the UK would be the second floor. Now I was trying to figure this one out a little bit as well. Today, in today's terms, I was thinking perhaps because in America a lot of people have basements, and in the UK that isn't really common to have a basement. Maybe buildings and shops would have basements, and some houses do as well, but really most houses, they don't have basements, particularly these old industrial revolution sort of houses, or built even in the 20s and 30s and even later. Just, you don't have a basement. So when you walk in, that's your first floor, and then the next one up is your second floor. But in the US, it would be, that's your first floor and the second floor, and if you have them downstairs, that will be your basement, which is really common. You see that anyway in a lot of films and television programs. So first floor, ground floor, who would win it? I would say, on sense, making sense, the ground floor is the ground. You are on the ground. There's no upper level, down level, so on. I would say the Americans just win that on accuracy. Okay, next, what would you call the long road where you can get multiple lanes for motor vehicles to travel on? In the US, it's the highway. In the UK, it's the motorway. Now this probably stems from, I'm thinking about it, in the olden days, for example in the 1800s, we had the famous Dick Turpin, famous highwayman. Now of course that was the highway, but then roads were built, and of course modern roads with tarmac, vehicles go on them. But I think the way America developed from the 1600s onwards, and then the road system, they just kept it as the highway, literally. Just keep it like that, roads, streets, highways. In the UK we changed it because of the motor car. We just had the old roads paved, maybe because of those meandering country lanes and roads, some of them quite narrow. And then when we started building wider roads, we needed to call it something, and motor vehicles went on them. So the motorway. So which would you say comes out on top on points here? I would say they're both accurate in their own way, obviously in each country, but highway is probably used more around the world. If you think of all the roads in so many countries, if you were to say motorway in many places, they might understand highway better. And in the news and things, you may hear people talking about the highway, but you can let me know if you're from somewhere else. So I would say highway probably would get the point here. Only they're equal, but highway is more well known. So I would give that on probably the better explanation, just because it's more commonly used. Okay, the next point. What would you call where they meet? Motor vehicles meet at some sort of crossing. In the US, you would call that an intersection. In the UK, you would call that a junction, whether it's a T shape, L shape, cross shape, and so on. So intersection, junction, which is better? I would have to say an intersection on this case, only because you know it's intersecting, and a junction could, you might also make you think of a junction point or a junction box or something like that. Although if you're familiar with junction in the UK, you know what that means. But would they use that internationally? I'm not sure. If, from the old days of the empire, if that was used in certain areas, certain countries might use things like that. But intersection probably explains it better, I would have thought. So if you were saying a road junction, that makes also sense. They're almost equal, but I would just give that perhaps to intersection. And junction, no, on sense of, yes, intersection better, but equal. I would have to give it equal, because they do make sense if you were explaining it to someone, or saying where the roads meet at that junction, where the roads meet at that intersection. I'll give it equal points for that. Okay, the next one. Okay, we've talked about buildings or apartments and apartment buildings. What happens when you get a group of them together? Now this is really, I've heard this a lot used in films and TV, and about the projects, and it's basically a housing project, and I believe that's a council run, owned, affordable for people, places to live. In the UK we would call that a council estate. So it's like an estate of houses or apartments in a block, or even a group of blocks. In the US, housing projects or the projects. Which is better? Well, if you put housing near projects, that is sort of self-explanatory. And a council estate, also, again, if you were someone from abroad who didn't have either of these terms, I think you would understand both. If you could, at least you could work it out. So I'll give that equal on points for this one. The next one is something that practically everybody uses in one form or another, and this is, what is this? Now in the US, you would ask to go to the restroom, and if you're using a bit more common language, you would say the John. In the UK, you would say the toilet, and if you want to use more commonly, you just say the loo. And more older, what you would say would be the bog, the loo or the bog, but we don't really use the bog anymore these days. Now the interesting one about this one is the John is really interesting, because this was named after John Harrington, who was there around 1605. He was actually one in Parliament at the time, and if you recognise that name, he's the ancestor of Kit Harington, who was in Game of Thrones, Jon Snow. Now he is credited as creating the first indoor flushing lavatory way back then in the 1600s, and of course that got shipped to the USA, and ever since they've been calling it the John after John Harrington. So John or the restroom, you'd ask for the restroom or the John, and here you'd ask for the toilet or the loo. So restroom or toilet. Restroom is very, of course, you'd understand it in the USA, but you don't exactly go there to rest, although that's being really specific. And the toilet is sort of explanatory wherever you go in the world. Excuse me, where are the toilets? You might not use it commonly where you are or in every country, but I think it's more explanatory. Of course, you have the man and woman symbol on the doors, on WC for water closet. That's another story. But I think on this one, if it was between restroom and toilet, I would stick with toilet. So I think the UK gets the point there for that one. The next one is this place, somewhere you would go just before you go into school at a young age, a preschool if you like. Americans will have, they call it kindergarten, and in the UK, nursery. Now, kindergarten, I think that's German. Kinder, I know it's children. Garten, I think it's school or something similar. So kindergarten is probably a derivative of the German. And we just call it a nursery. Kindergarten, nursery, which would get the point. Or preschool, just before you go to school. Kindergarten, by the way, goes at the age of about 5 to 6 in the US. And nursery, we go between the ages of 4, about the ages of 4 to 5. And it's a way to play and learn before you actually go into your first year. The kindergarten might actually be the first year, but you can let me know on that one, which is better. Kindergarten, we all understand that one, but I like nursery better. I think it's more explanatory, although nursery has other meanings as well. I would say I would have to give it equal because they're both good, to be honest, and they're both acceptable. I don't know how widely used they are in the world, but they're both okay to use and understandable. Okay, the next one will be this sort of shop. Well, you would go specifically to buy alcohol. In America, it's the liquor store. In UK, the off license. Now in the UK, I can believe you can get alcohol in all sorts of places. In the supermarket, in corner convenience stores and so on. But I think in the US, you may specifically have to get it in liquor stores and of course in certain, convenience stores and stuff and such and like. You can't just in certain places get them, like in supermarkets, I believe. You have to get specifically, but you can let me know about that one as well, in case that's changed or different. Who gets that better, an off license or a liquor store? I would say liquor store is just self-explanatory. It's more accurate. An off license, yes, but not really. So the point goes to the USA on this one. The next one, where you go to learn, but specifically in education that's not run by the state, private school. Now this is where it gets confusing. Private school in the USA, public school in the UK, where the rich or those with money would send their kids. So what is public school in the US? Well, that's our state school. It used to be called secondary schools, grammar schools and so on. They've now gone and changed it to academies and all this. No more grammar and secondary so much. But that's it. Public school in the US is a state school here. So that's a modern change, but which is better? Well, when it comes to private school and public school, I would say private school is just self-explanatory. You know it's private straight away, and it stops the confusion. So America gets the point there. When it comes to public school and state school, I think equal points there because they're both accurate. Okay, so this next, mode of transport. So some of these cross the streets, we're at crossways, but most of them are on rails. So what is this? This is the railroad in the USA. In the UK, it's the railway system, or railways, or railway. So which is better, railroad, railway? I would say, to be honest, the way for the rails and the road for the rails, equal points. They're both self-explanatory, even all the way around the world. Even though maybe railway is used more around the world. Perhaps, again, maybe because of empire and so on, and when we're talking about it, they're both self-explanatory. Okay, the next one you get, at a supermarket or store. What are these called? In the USA, a shopping cart. In the UK, shopping trolley. So which is better, shopping cart, shopping trolley? I think if you think about it as a cart and you're shopping, so it's on wheels, although a trolley is on wheels, a shopping cart is probably better that way. I don't know if it's used widely around the world, but there you go. Shopping cart, I'll give that point to the USA. Okay, now what about when you go walking on the streets? What do you walk on? Classic American sidewalk. That paving area in the UK, the pavement. So it's paved over, whether it's tiles, cobblestones, tarmac, whatever. Sidewalk in the USA, pavement in the UK. Which is better? I think they're both equally okay. However, the sidewalk is self-explanatory. It's where you walk on the side. It's literal. And I would say it's a better way of explaining it. So I would give that a point to the USA on that one. Okay, the next one is what's this? Sandwich? That's not sandwich. Subway? No. This is underground. This is underground, the underground system, or the subway. Subway in the USA, underground in the UK. Now, if you're in London, like I am, it's also known as the Tube. So it's where the first underground system was created and used. Now, what's really interesting about this one is that you'd think these places, and you do hear of them all over the world. However, there's not as many as you think. There's more than perhaps you suspect, but not as many as you think. If you think that there's hundreds and hundreds of cities, large and small, in the world, hundreds if not thousands of cities in the world, there's actually these metro systems, which are electrified of course today, which weren't in the beginning. They are, as of December 2017, in 178 cities and in 56 countries around the world, hosting approximately 180 metro systems. And there's one opening in Jakarta, that's the capital of Indonesia, or certainly in Indonesia, opening this month actually in March 2019. So I think that might bring it up to 181. So there's only 181 in the entire world ever since its conception about 150 years ago. You can imagine that had steam trains in the beginning, but luckily literally within decades then came electricity, and that made things so much simpler to go deeper, faster and underground and cleaner as well. So going back to the words subway and underground, I would say that's a bit confusing as well, only because in the subway, not confusing but different, because subway in the UK means like a underpass for human traffic, human walkers, whereas if it's for cars it's an underpass. But subway means the trains, so here it means underground. So which is better? I think they're equal points in this case. Okay, hopefully you're not bored yet, just 3 more to go. So next one is, you've got a break. You're not going to work, you've got 2 weeks and you're going to go away. What do you call that in the USA? Commonly called vacation. In the UK would call that a holiday. So you go on your vacation, in the UK you go on your holiday. So which is better, a vacation or holiday? Well, Americans will be familiar with holiday as in a holiday period, but they go on vacation meaning very specific. In the UK you go on your holiday, but you still have holiday periods, meaning like at Christmas or at Easter and so on, over those sort of areas. I think they're both equal. They both explain it. If people are familiar with the words vacation and holiday, if they're not, then it certainly was used back in, so often, but with television and the internet and so on, I think most people would understand that. So I'd give them equal points. Okay, this next one. Commonly front or back of a house, what would you call this area? In USA, it's your yard or your lawn. And in the UK, it's your garden. Now, I do believe Americans call it their garden as well, but that might refer maybe to a back garden or backyard. But I think commonly they call it a yard. And the front, or if it's grass, it'll be a lawn. We do have lawns here as well, which we would call that. But we might say it's lawned, or it's a lawn in the front garden or the back garden. So I think lawn is common on either side. So it would be down to yard and garden. Well, a yard, I think the reason why it's called yards and lawns, because you've got more room in the USA. And a garden for us could be really small. We could have a house with a little garden in the front and the back, compared to the USA, which has more land, and you can have bigger gardens even in houses. For example, when it comes to your houses, our small houses are really tiny in the USA. So your a medium house in the UK is what you would call a small house. And a large house in the UK, generally speaking, you would call a medium house. And then of course you get bigger. So our small houses here, you would say are quite small, really small, tiny almost. So since we have a lot of these houses built in the industrial or on that format of the Industrial Revolution, they have small gardens front and back. So that makes sense. When if you have a bigger garden, you're going to have a yard, something much bigger, a bigger an area front or back. So which one's better? I think garden's more self-explanatory, but a yard also makes sense. I would give them equal points. Now the last one. How do you send letters? You always need to put a certain thing at the bottom of the address. In the US, it's a zip code. In the UK, a postcode. Zip code, postcode. Now it's very familiar, zip code in the USA, but postcode, it's got to do with the post. I would give that point just on self-explanatory into the UK. 1 point for the UK on that one, just for self-explanatory. Zip code we're familiar with, but a zip, no, it's numbers or letters or just numbers. So looking at it here, the USA scores 19 points and the UK 14. So the US actually scores almost completely 1 point for every single one and only equals, which actually means it doesn't lose a point, whereas the UK loses about 5 times more. Only once does the US lose. So that's probably because the US will say things more accurately and maybe more widely known as well. But this is just my opinion. You may disagree. See how many points you allocated and tell me if it's any different. Okay, that's it for now. The next part will be on food. So until then, bye.